In 1962, 17 coal miners descended into the depths of the Blackwater Mine in Matawan, West Virginia, for their morning shift. None of them ever came back up. The official report blamed a catastrophic methane explosion that collapsed 3 tunnels, sealing the miners inside. The company paid settlements to the families. The mine was permanently closed, and Matawan moved on from its tragedy. But 50 years later, when the county sheriff was reviewing old archives, he found something that contradicted everything the town had been told: a sealed room deep underground that had never been touched by any explosion. What he discovered inside would force him to reopen a case that powerful people had spent 50 years trying to bury, and prove that sometimes the deadliest secrets are the ones closest to home. Sheriff Danny Morrison had been putting off cleaning out the old file room for 3 years, but the new computer system meant all the paper records had to be sorted, scanned, or thrown away. It was tedious work that he'd been doing in chunks after his regular shifts when the county building was quiet and he could think. The basement storage room smelled like dust and old paper, with boxes stacked floor to ceiling dating back to the 1940s. Most of it was routine stuff: property disputes, minor arrests, budget reports that nobody would ever need again. But Danny was methodical by nature, the kind of cop who read every page before deciding what to keep. That's how he found the file marked Blackwater Mine Incident 1962. The folder was thick, wedged between a stack of old traffic citations and a box of courthouse maintenance records. Danny had heard the story growing up: 17 miners killed in an explosion, the worst tragedy in Matawan's history. His own grandfather used to work the mines before switching to construction. Always said it was dangerous work, but good pay for a man with limited options. Danny pulled the file out and set it on the old wooden table he'd been using as a workspace. The incident report was yellowed with age, typed on an old typewriter with letters that had seen better days. The header read Mingo County Sheriff's Department, with the date stamped below: April 23, 1962. Location: Blackwater Mine, Route 52, Matawan, West Virginia. Incident type: industrial accident, multiple fatalities. According to the report, at approximately 11:47 a.m., a methane gas explosion had occurred in the eastern section of the mine. 17 miners were underground when it happened. All were presumed dead due to tunnel collapse and rescue teams being unable to reach the affected areas. Then came the list that made Danny's blood run cold. 17 names, 17 men who never made it home that day, 17 families destroyed in a single morning. But one name on that list made him stop reading entirely: Morrison James Patrick, age 31, lead foreman. Morrison. His grandfather's name had been James Patrick Morrison. Danny felt something cold settle in his stomach. His grandfather had died when Danny was 12, but he'd always been told it was a heart attack. The family never talked about him working in the mines. Danny's father had always said his grandfather worked construction, built houses, stayed away from the dangerous underground work. But here was his grandfather's name listed as the lead foreman of the crew that died in the Blackwater Mine explosion. Danny flipped through the rest of the file, looking for more details. There were photographs, black and white images of the mine entrance, rescue equipment, officials in suits talking to reporters. But what caught his attention was a handwritten note clipped to the back of the incident report: Investigation incomplete. Recommend further inquiry into company safety protocols and timeline of events. Several discrepancies noted in witness statements. Deputy R. Collins. Below that, in different handwriting, case closed by order of Sheriff Hawkins. No further investigation required. Danny stared at the note. Someone had wanted to investigate further, but had been told to stop. Why would a sheriff shut down an investigation into 17 deaths? He kept reading. The next document was a settlement agreement between Cumberland Coal Company and the families of the victims.
Each family received $5,000, a significant amount in 1962, but not enough to compensate for losing a husband and father. What was strange was how quickly everything had been settled. The explosion happened on April 23rd. By May 15th, less than 2 weeks later, all the families had signed settlement agreements and the mine had been permanently sealed. Danny had investigated enough industrial accidents to know they usually took months or years to resolve, especially ones involving multiple fatalities. Companies fought payouts, insurance companies demanded extensive investigations, families hired lawyers and filed lawsuits. But the Blackwater mine case had been wrapped up in less than a month. At the bottom of the file was a manila envelope marked Evidence, Property of Cumberland Coal Company. Inside were what looked like geological survey reports, pages covered with technical diagrams and mineral composition analyses that Danny couldn't understand. But one phrase kept appearing throughout the surveys: high-grade uranium ore deposits, estimated value $2.3 million per ton. Danny sat back in his chair, the pieces clicking into his mind. In 1962, uranium was incredibly valuable. The Cold War was at its peak, nuclear weapons were being built as fast as possible, and uranium deposits were strategic resources. If the Blackwater mine contained uranium worth millions of dollars per ton, that changed everything about the explosion. It wasn't just an industrial accident, it was potentially a cover-up to hide valuable mineral deposits. Danny's radio crackled to life, making him jump. "Sheriff Morrison, you copy?" He keyed the mic. "Go ahead, dispatch." "Got a call from the state mining inspector's office. They want to schedule a meeting about some old mine safety records they need for a federal audit. Should I set something up?" Danny looked down at the file spread across his table, at his grandfather's name on the victims list, at the uranium surveys that had never been made public. "Tell them I'll call them back," he said. "I need to look into something first." As he hung up the radio, Danny made a decision. He was going to drive out to the old Blackwater mine site and see what remained of the place where his grandfather had supposedly died 50 years ago, because something about this file didn't add up. And if there was one thing Danny had learned in 15 years of police work, it's that when official stories moved too fast and settled too easily, there were usually secrets worth uncovering. He gathered up the files, locked them in his truck, and headed out onto Route 52. The Blackwater mine was only 20 minutes from town, but Danny had never been, never had a reason to visit the site of a 50-year-old tragedy. But as he drove through the winding mountain roads, Danny couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to discover his grandfather hadn't died the way his family had always believed. And if he was right about that, then maybe 17 other families had been lied to as well. The question was, who had lied to them, and what had they been trying to hide? The road to the Blackwater mine had been abandoned almost as long as the mine itself. Danny's patrol car bounced over potholes and cracked asphalt that nature was slowly reclaiming, weeds growing through the gaps like green fingers trying to erase the past. The entrance gate hung open on rusted hinges, a faded sign still visible: Cumberland Coal Company, authorized personnel only. Below it, someone had spray-painted "Danger, Keep Out" in red letters that had bled down the metal like dried blood. Danny parked beside the gate and stepped out into the mountain silence. The air smelled of pine trees and old coal dust, with an underlying dampness that seemed to seep up from the earth itself. 50 years of weather had softened the industrial scars, but the bones of the operation were still visible. Concrete foundations where buildings had stood, rusted rail tracks that once carried coal cars, and, in the distance, the dark mouth of the mine shaft sealed behind a wall of concrete and steel. Danny walked up the gravel road, his boots crunching on stones mixed with coal fragments that still littered the ground. The deeper he went into the site, the more wrong everything felt. Danny had seen other abandoned mines during his time as sheriff, places that had been shut down due to declining coal prices or environmental regulations. But the Blackwater mine looked different. It looked like it had been abandoned in a hurry. Near what had once been the main office building, Danny found scattered papers, half buried under decades of leaves. Most of them were too damaged to read, but he could make out fragments, timesheets, safety reports, personnel records, the kind of paperwork that companies usually secured or destroyed when closing operations. More concerning was what he found near the sealed mine entrance: concrete blocks and steel reinforcement that looked far more extensive than necessary for a simple closure. This wasn't just sealing a dangerous mine shaft. This looked like someone had been determined to make sure nothing could ever get in or out. Danny walked around the perimeter of the seal, studying the construction. The concrete was poured thick, with steel beams welded across the opening in a crosshatch pattern. But what caught his attention were the dates stamped into the concrete at ground level: April 24, 1962, and April 25, 1962. April 24th and April 25th, 1960.
His first call was to the West Virginia Department of Mining Safety. "I need to speak to someone about historical mine records," he told the receptionist. "Hold, please." After several transfers, Danny found himself talking to a records clerk named Betty Mason, who had been with the department for 30 years. "Blackwater Mine?" she repeated when Danny explained what he was looking for. "That name sounds familiar, but I can't place it. What year did you say?" 1962. Explosion that killed 17 miners. "Let me check our database." Danny heard typing in the background. "That's strange. I'm not finding any incident reports for Blackwater Mine in 1962. Are you sure about the name and date?" Danny stared at the files spread across his desk. "I'm holding the county sheriff's incident report right now. 17 miners killed in a methane explosion on April 23, 1962. Sir, I've been maintaining these records for 3 decades. We have documentation for every mine fatality in West Virginia going back to the 1920s. If 17 miners died in 1962, there would definitely be a state investigation file. But there isn't one." "No, sir. According to our database, there was no mining incident involving multiple fatalities in Mingo County in 1962. Danny felt something cold crawl up his spine. "What about Cumberland Coal Company? Do you have any records for them operating mines in the Matewan area?" More typing. "I show Cumberland Coal Company operating several mines in southern West Virginia in the 1960s, but this is odd. Their Matewan operation shows a closure date of April 22, 1962, 1 day before your reported incident. They closed the mine the day before the explosion?" "According to our records, yes. And sir, the closure was listed as administrative, no reason given." Danny thanked Betty Mason and hung up, his mind racing. The state had no record of the explosion. Cumberland Coal had officially closed the mine the day before it happened, and someone was still watching the site 50 years later. He picked up the phone again and dialed his father's number. "Dad, I need to ask you about Grandpa." His father was quiet for a moment. "What about him? How did he really die?" Another pause, longer this time. "Danny, why are you asking about this now?" "Because I found a file that says he was killed in a mine explosion in 1962 along with 16 other men, but you always told me he died of a heart attack." His father's voice went very quiet. "Where did you find this file?" "In the county records." "Dad, what really happened to him?" "Son, there are some things that are better left buried. Your grandfather wouldn't want you digging into this." 17 men died, Dad. 17 families were lied to. If Grandpa was one of them— "Danny," his father's voice was sharp, "now drop this. Trust me, some stones are better left unturned." The line went dead. Danny stared at the phone, his father's warning echoing in his head. But as he looked at his grandfather's name on the victims list, at the uranium surveys in the evidence envelope, at the photos he'd taken of the hastily sealed mine entrance, he knew he couldn't let it go. 17 men had died. Their families had been paid off and told to stay quiet, and 50 years later, someone was still watching to make sure the truth stayed buried. Danny Morrison was about to find out why. Danny spent the rest of the afternoon trying to track down the families of the other 16 miners listed in the incident report. Most of the surnames were familiar names he'd seen on mailboxes, heard at town council meetings, families whose descendants still lived in and around Matewan. But when he started making calls, he hit the same wall over and over again. Henderson family? Oh, they moved away years ago, right after old Bill died, I think. The Caldwells? Haven't seen any of them since I was a kid. Heard they went up north somewhere. Bobby Garrett's family. They used to live on Elm Street, but the house has been empty for decades. By 5 o'clock, Danny had made 23 phone calls and found exactly 0 living relatives of the Blackwater mine victims. In a town where families went back generations, where people knew everyone's business going back 50 years, somehow all the families connected to the worst mining disaster in local history had simply vanished. That wasn't normal. That wasn't even possible. Danny locked the files in his desk and drove home, but he couldn't let it go. He lived in a small house on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where he could think without interruption. After a dinner he barely tasted, he sat on his back porch with a beer and his laptop, using the internet to search for traces of the missing families. What he found was disturbing. According to public records, 6 of the 17 families had sold their homes and moved out of state within 6 months of the mine incident. 3 more had relocated within West Virginia, but to counties far from Matewan. The remaining 8 families had simply disappeared from the records entirely. No forwarding addresses, no death certificates, no trace of what had happened to them. Danny had investigated enough missing persons cases to know that entire families didn't just vanish without leaving some kind of paper trail. People had social security numbers, tax records, medical files. Someone always knew something. But the families of the Blackwater mine victims had been erased as thoroughly as if they'd never existed. His phone rang, interrupting his research. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize. Sheriff Morrison? That's right. My name is Carl Hutchkins. I heard you've been asking questions about the old mine incident. Danny sat up straighter. Who told you that? Word travels fast in a small town, Sheriff. I was wondering if we could meet and talk. There are some things you should know before you dig too deep into this. What kind of things? The kind that got a lot of good people hurt back in 1962. The kind that could still get people hurt today. Danny felt his pulse quicken. Are you threatening me, Mr. Hutchkins? No, sir. I'm trying to warn you. There's a difference. Where do you want to meet? You know the old diner on Route 119, about 10 miles north of town. I'll be there at 8. Come alone and don't tell anyone where you're going. The line went dead before Danny could respond. Danny stared at his phone, every instinct telling him this was a bad idea. Meeting unknown contacts in isolated locations was exactly the kind of thing that got law enforcement officers killed. But Carl Hutchkins had information about the mine incident, and Danny needed answers more than he needed safety. He holstered his service weapon, grabbed his truck keys, and headed out into the mountain darkness. The diner on Route 119 had been closed for years, but the parking lot lights were still working, casting yellow pools of illumination across cracked asphalt. Danny arrived 15 minutes early and did a careful sweep of the area, looking for signs of an ambush or backup vehicles. The place appeared deserted, except for a single pickup truck parked near the diner's entrance. At exactly 8 p.m., a man emerged from the shadows near the building. He was probably in his 70s, with white hair and the kind of weathered face that came from decades of outdoor work. He moved carefully, like someone whose joints seen better days, but his eyes were sharp and alert. Sheriff Morrison? Mr. Hutchkins. They shook hands, and Danny noticed his grip was still strong despite his age. Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would. You said you had information about the mine incident. Hutchkins nodded toward a picnic table near the edge of the parking lot. Let's sit. This is going to take a while. They settled across from each other, and Hutchkins pulled a thermos from his jacket pocket. Coffee? I'm good. Talk to me about 1962. Hutchkins poured himself a cup and took a long sip before speaking. I was 22 years old then, worked at the mine for about 3 years, usually on the day shift, but on April 23rd, I called in sick. Danny felt his pulse quicken. You were supposed to be working the day of the explosion? Should have been down there with the rest of them. James Morrison was my shift supervisor. Good man, fair boss. If I hadn't had food poisoning that morning, I'd be dead too. So you believe the explosion really happened? Hutchkins laughed bitterly. Sheriff, there was no explosion. The words hung in the night air like a physical thing. Danny leaned forward. What do you mean? I mean, those 17 men didn't die in any methane blast. They were murdered, shot down in the tunnels like dogs, and then buried behind concrete and steel so nobody could ever find the bodies. Danny's mouth dried. How do you know this? Because I saw it happen. Hutchkins sat down his coffee cup and looked Danny in the eye. I may have called in sick, but I couldn't sleep that morning.
Felt guilty about leaving my crew short-handed, so around noon I drove out to the mine to see if they needed me for the afternoon shift. He paused, his hand shaking slightly as he picked up the thermos again. When I got there, I heard gunshots coming from underground. Not one or two, a lot of them, like a war was happening down in those tunnels. What did you do? Hid behind one of the equipment sheds and waited. About 20 minutes later, men started coming up from the mine. Not miners, men in suits carrying rifles. And behind them came more men in work clothes, but they weren't Cumberland Coal employees. I'd never seen any of them. Danny pulled out his notebook. How many? 8 or 10, maybe more. They spent the next 2 hours bringing up equipment, files, boxes of stuff, loading it all into trucks that weren't marked with any company names. Did you recognize anyone? Hutchins grinned Monette, Harold Vance, the Cumberland Coal site supervisor, and Sheriff Hawkins, both of them armed, both of them giving orders like they were running the show. Danny felt ice in his veins. The sheriff was involved up to his neck. I watched him personally supervise the concrete trucks when they came to seal the mine entrance. Must have been 6 or 7 loads of concrete, way more than you'd need just to close a shaft. Why didn't you report what you saw? Hutchins laughed, but there was no humor in it. To who? The sheriff's department? Harold Vance owned half the county commissioners. And sheriff, you have to understand, this was 1962. The Cold War was hot. The government had all kinds of black projects running, and people who asked too many questions had a way of disappearing. Danny studied the old man's face in the parking lot lights. But you're telling me now? Because I'm 73 years old and I've been carrying this secret for 50 years. Because those 17 men had families who deserved to know the truth. And because... Hutchins hesitated. Because what? Because they're still out there, Sheriff. The people who ordered those killings. Maybe not the same individuals, but the same organization.
Concentration, 2.7% by weight. Estimated reserves, 47,000 tons. Current market value, $127 million. Danny whistled low. $127 million in 1962? Worth maybe 10 times that in today's money, Hutchins said. And Sheriff, that was just the uranium. There were other minerals down there too, rare earth elements that were even more valuable for weapons research. Danny folded the paper carefully and put it in his jacket pocket, along with the shell casing. Mr. Hutchins, if you've had this evidence for 50 years, why didn't you ever... Because they killed anyone who tried. Hutchins' voice was flat. 3 months after the mine incident, Deputy Collins, the one who wanted to investigate further, died in a car accident on a straight stretch of road he'd driven 1,000 times. 6 months later, a newspaper reporter from Charleston, who was asking questions about the mine, died of a sudden heart attack at age 31. A year later, Harold Vance's own secretary disappeared completely after someone saw her photocopying company files. Danny felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountaineer. They've been killing people to cover this up for 50 years? Anyone who got too close to the truth? Sheriff, I'm telling you this because those 17 men deserve justice, but I'm also telling you because if you're not careful, you're going to be number 18. As if summoned by Hutchins' words, headlights appeared on Route 119, moving slowly toward the diner. Both men watched as a dark sedan pulled into the parking lot and stopped about 50 yards away, its engine running, but the driver staying inside. "Time for me to go," Hutchins said, standing up quickly. "Sheriff, be very careful who you trust. This conspiracy has roots in places you wouldn't expect." "Wait," Danny said. "How do I contact you if I need more information?" But Hutchins was already walking toward his truck. "You don't. After tonight, Carl Hutchins is going to disappear, just like those 17 families did. It's the only way to stay alive." He got in his truck and drove off, leaving Danny alone in the parking lot with a dark sedan and a shell casing that proved 17 men had been murdered for a uranium deposit worth over $1 billion in today's money. The sedan's driver door opened, and a man in a suit stepped out. Danny's hand moved to his service weapon as the man walked slowly across the parking lot toward him. "Sheriff Morrison," the man called out, "I think we need to talk."
The man in the suit was younger than Danny had expected, maybe 45, with the kind of clean-cut appearance that screamed federal agent. He walked with the confident stride of someone who was used to being in control of situations, his hands visible, but ready to move quickly if needed. "Agent James Crawford, FBI," he said, pulling out a badge wallet. "Mind if we have a conversation?" Danny kept his hand near his weapon. "Depends on what kind of conversation you have in mind. The kind where I explain why poking around in 50-year-old mining accidents might not be in your best interest or the best interest of your community." "Is that a threat, Agent Crawford?" Crawford smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "It's practical advice from someone who knows more about the Blackwater situation than you do." Danny studied the man's face in the parking lot lights. "How did you know I was here?" "We've been monitoring communications related to the Blackwater mine since this morning. Your phone calls to the state mining office triggered some automated flags in our system." "Your system? What system would that be?" Crawford gestured toward the picnic table where Danny had been sitting with Hutchkins. "Mind if we sit? This might take a few minutes." Against his better judgment, Danny nodded. They sat across from each other, and Crawford pulled out a manila folder from his jacket. "Sheriff Morrison, what I'm about to tell you is classified information that I'm sharing with you as a professional courtesy. The Blackwater mine incident in 1962 was part of a federal operation related to national security interests during the Cold War." "What kind of operation?" Crawford opened the folder and showed Danny a document with heavy black redactions covering most of the text. "Uranium extraction for weapons development. The miners who died weren't victims of an industrial accident. They were casualties of a necessary operation to secure strategic materials for the defense of the United States." Danny felt an anger building in his chest. "You're telling me the federal government murdered 17 miners?" "I'm telling you that during the Cold War, difficult decisions had to be made to protect national security. The uranium deposits at Blackwater were critical to our nuclear weapons program. When the miners discovered the true nature of what they were extracting, they became a security risk." "So you killed them?" Crawford's expression didn't change. "The operation was carried out by contractors working under federal authority. The miners were offered relocation packages to other parts of the country with new identities and financial compensation. Most accepted, some didn't." Danny pulled out his notebook. "Carl Hutchkins said he saw men with rifles coming up from the mine. He said he heard gunshots." Crawford closed the folder. "Carl Hutchkins is a 73-year-old man whose memory of events from 50 years ago may not be entirely reliable. There were no gunshots, Sheriff. There was no mass murder. There was a controlled relocation of civilian personnel who had access to classified information." "Then why was my grandfather listed as dead in the county incident report?" "Because James Morrison refused relocation. He insisted on staying in Maidawarn, continuing to work at the mine, potentially compromising the entire operation. He was given multiple opportunities to accept the relocation package." Crawford leaned forward, his voice dropping. "Your grandfather was a patriot, Sheriff, but he was also stubborn. When he threatened to go public with information about the uranium extraction, difficult decisions had to be made." Danny felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. "You murdered my grandfather because he wouldn't keep quiet about a government mining operation?" "Your grandfather died in service to his country, just like soldiers who die in classified missions overseas. The difference is, we couldn't give him a medal or a military funeral without compromising national security." Danny stood up abruptly. "You murdered 17 miners and covered it up." Crawford remained seated, his voice calm. "Sheriff, I understand this is difficult information to process, but you need to understand the bigger picture here. The uranium extracted from Blackwater Mine was used to build nuclear weapons that helped end the Cold War and protect American lives for decades. By killing American citizens? By making hard choices in difficult times?" Crawford stood up and closed his folder. The same kinds of hard choices that are still being made today to protect national security. Danny felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Is that why you're here? To make sure I make the right choice? I'm here to offer you the same opportunity your grandfather was given. Walk away from this investigation and your family stays safe. Your career continues uninterrupted. Life goes on normal. And if I don't walk away? Crawford smiled again, and this time there was something predatory in his expression. Sheriff, you're investigating the deaths of 17 men who supposedly died 50 years ago. If something were to happen to you during that investigation, an accident at an abandoned mine site, maybe a structural collapse in an old tunnel, it would be a tragic but understandable occupational hazard. Danny's hand moved to his service weapon. Now that definitely sounds like a threat. It's a reality check, Crawford said. The people who ordered the Blackwater operation are still alive, still in positions of power, still making decisions about national security. They've spent 50 years protecting this secret, and they're not going to let a small-town sheriff expose it now. Crawford walked back toward his sedan, then turned around. You have 24 hours to decide, Sheriff. After that, the offer expires. What offer? The offer to walk away and live a long, quiet life. Crawford got in his car and rolled down the window. Oh, and Sheriff, Carl Hutchkins won't be available for any more conversations. He's decided to take an extended vacation out of state permanently. The sedan pulled away, leaving Danny alone in the parking lot with a dark sedan and a shell casing that proved 17 men had been murdered for a uranium deposit worth over $1 billion in today's money. The sedan's driver door opened, and a man in a suit stepped out. Danny's hand moved to his service weapon as the man walked slowly across the parking lot toward him. "Sheriff Morrison," the man called out, "I think we need to talk." The man in the suit was younger than Danny had expected, maybe 45, with the kind of clean-cut appearance that screamed federal agent. He walked with the confident stride of someone who was used to being in control of situations, his hands visible, but ready to move quickly if needed. "Agent James Crawford, FBI," he said, pulling out a badge wallet. "Mind if we have a conversation?" Danny kept his hand near his weapon. "Depends on what kind of conversation you have in mind. The kind where I explain why poking around in 50-year-old mining accidents might not be in your best interest, or the best interest of your community. Is that a threat, Agent Crawford?" Crawford smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes.
His father sitting in his recliner, staring at the television without really watching it. His mother answered the door in her bathrobe, her face tight with worry. "Danny, what's going on? Your father won't tell me anything about those men who came by." "Mom, I need you and Dad to pack a bag and drive to Charleston tonight. Stay with Aunt Sarah for a few days." "Why? What's happening?" Danny's father appeared behind her, his expression grim. "Because our son has decided to poke a hornet's nest that's been quiet for 50 years. "James Morrison was my grandfather," Danny said. "I have a right to know how he really died." His father stepped onto the porch and closed the door behind him. "Danny, let me tell you something about your grandfather that I never wanted you to know. He was a good man, but he was also stubborn as a mule. When he got an idea in his head about right and wrong, nothing could change his mind." "That sounds like something to be proud of." "It is, but it's also what got him killed." His father's voice dropped to a whisper. "Your grandfather found something in that mine that he wasn't supposed to see. Government men came and told him to keep quiet, offered him money to relocate the family. He refused, said he had a responsibility to his community, to the other miners. So they murdered him? They made him disappear, along with anyone else who wouldn't take their money and keep their mouth shut." His father gripped Danny's shoulder. "Son, I was 10 years old when it happened. I watched my mother cry herself to sleep every night for 2 years after we were told he died in an explosion. I watched our neighbors pack up and leave town one by one until there was nobody left who remembered what really happened." Danny felt something cold settle in his chest. How many people knew the truth?
Everybody knew something was wrong. You don't lose 17 men in an explosion and have it wrapped up in 3 weeks unless powerful people want it wrapped up. But nobody talked about it because the families who asked too many questions ended up like the Hendersons. What happened to the Hendersons? His father was quiet for a long moment. Billy Henderson's widow refused to sign the settlement papers, said she wanted a real investigation into how her husband died. 3 months later, their house burned down in the middle of the night. Martha Henderson and her 2 kids died in the fire. Official cause was electrical problems, but everybody knew better. Danny felt sick. They killed a woman and her children? They killed anyone who threatened to expose the truth. And now you're threatening to do the same thing. His father looked toward the street where a sedan with tinted windows was parked under a streetlight. They're watching us right now. Danny, those men who came by earlier, they're still here. Danny followed his father's gaze and saw the car. It hadn't been there when he arrived. All the more reason for you to get out of town tonight, Danny said. Drive to Charleston. Stay with Aunt Sarah. Don't tell anyone where you're going. His mother appeared in the doorway again. Danny, why can't you just let sleeping dogs lie? Your grandfather's been gone 50 years. Digging this up won't bring him back, but it might bring justice for 17 families who were lied to and threatened into silence. And it might get you killed, his father said. Is that what you want? Is that what your grandfather would want? Danny thought about the shell casing in his pocket, about Carl Hutchins' terrified face in the diner parking lot, about Agent Crawford's casual threats. His father was right. Pursuing this investigation could get him killed, but it could also expose a conspiracy that had been murdering innocent people for half a century. I'll be careful, Danny said, but I can't walk away from this. His father nodded slowly. I knew you'd say that. You're just like him, you know. Same stubborn streak, same sense of right and wrong. He sighed. We'll pack a bag and leave tonight. But Danny, if something happens to you, if you disappear like your grandfather did, I want you to know that we understand why you did it. Danny hugged both his parents, knowing it might be the last time he saw them. As he walked back to his truck, he noticed the sedan's engine start up. They were going to follow him, which meant his parents would be safe once he led the surveillance away from their house. Danny drove toward the center of town, taking a circuitous route that would give his parents time to pack and leave. The sedan stayed behind him, maintaining a professional distance, but making no effort to hide their presence. They wanted him to know he was being watched. At the sheriff's office, Danny parked under the lights and walked inside, knowing the surveillance team would have to decide whether to follow him into a law enforcement building or wait outside. They chose to wait. Danny went to his desk and opened the locked drawer where he'd stored the Blackwater mine files. Everything was still there, but something felt different. The papers were stacked slightly differently than he'd left them, and there was a faint smell of cologne in the air that hadn't been there before. Someone had been through his desk. Danny gathered up the files and his laptop, then walked to the back exit of the building. His patrol car was parked in the rear lot, away from the street where the surveillance team was waiting. If he was lucky, he could get a few hours head start before they realized he'd slipped away. But first, he needed to make a stop that might get him the breakthrough he needed. 20 minutes later, Danny pulled up in front of a small house on the edge of Matewan's industrial district. The address had taken him an hour of searching through property records, but he'd finally found what he was looking for. The current address of Ruth Morrison, his grandfather's sister. Aunt Ruth was 86 years old and lived alone in a house filled with 50 years of accumulated memories. She answered the door in a housecoat, her white hair in curlers, squinting at him through thick glasses. "Danny, what are you doing here at this hour?" "Aunt Ruth, I need to ask you about Grandpa James." Her expression changed immediately, weariness replacing confusion. "What about him?" "I found the real file about how he died. I know about the mine, about the uranium, about what really happened to those 17 men." Ruth Morrison looked past Danny toward the street, checking for surveillance, then pulled him inside and locked the door behind him. "You shouldn't be here. They're probably watching." "Who's watching?" "The same people who've been watching our family for 50 years. The same people who made sure nobody ever talked about what really happened at Blackwater." Ruth led him to the kitchen and put on a pot of coffee, her hands shaking slightly as she worked. Danny, there are things about your grandfather that your father doesn't know, things I promised never to tell anyone." "What kind of things?" Ruth sat down across from him at the kitchen table. "Your grandfather didn't just refuse to take their money and keep quiet. He was documenting everything that happened at that mine. He had proof of the uranium extraction, proof of the government involvement, proof of the cover-up." Danny leaned forward. "What happened to the proof?" "He hid it somewhere safe, somewhere he thought nobody would ever find it." Ruth's eyes filled with tears. "The night before he died, he came here and gave me a key, said if anything happened to him, I should give it to someone who could use it to get justice for the other families." She stood up and walked to an old grandfather clock in the corner of the kitchen. Behind the pendulum, taped to the back panel, was a small brass key. "I've been carrying this secret for 50 years, Ruth said, handing Danny the key, "waiting for someone in the family to be brave enough to finish what James started." Danny turned the key over in his hands. It was old and tarnished, with numbers etched on the metal. 247. "What does it open?" Ruth smiled for the first time since she'd arrived. "Your grandfather rented a safety deposit box at the First National Bank in Logan County under a false name. Everything he documented about Blackwater is in that box." Danny felt his pulse quicken. "What name did he use?" "Patrick Morrison, his middle name and our maiden name." Ruth gripped Danny's hand. "Danny, if what's in that box is as damaging as your grandfather believed, the people who killed him won't hesitate to kill you too." "I know, but Aunt Ruth, if I don't do this, they'll keep killing people to protect their secret. How many more Carl Hutchkins are going to disappear? How many more families are going to be threatened into silence?" Ruth nodded slowly. "Your grandfather would be proud of you and terrified for you." She walked to the window and peered through the curtains. "There's a car across the street that wasn't there when you arrived." Danny joined her at the window. A different sedan was parked under a streetlight, engine running. "They found me," he said, "which means they'll be watching the bank tomorrow." "Then you'll have to be smarter than they are," Ruth said, "the same way your grandfather was smarter than them for 50 years. Danny kissed his aunt on the cheek and headed for the back door. "If anyone asks, I was never here." "Danny," Ruth called after him, "be careful, and remember your grandfather didn't die for nothing if you can finally get justice for those 17 families." Danny slipped out the back door and through Ruth's neighbor's yard, making his way to where he'd parked his patrol car 3 blocks away. The surveillance team would be watching the front of Ruth's house, waiting for him to leave the way he came in. As he drove toward Logan County and the First National Bank, Danny realized he was now carrying the key to evidence that could expose a 50-year conspiracy involving mass murder and corporate cover-ups. But he was also being hunted by federal agents who had been killing witnesses for half a century. The race was on to see who would get to James Morrison's safety deposit box first, Danny or the people who murdered his grandfather to keep him from opening it. The First National Bank in Logan County opened at 9 a.m., but Danny arrived at 7:30 to study the building and plan his approach. The surveillance sedan had followed him part way, but disappeared once he crossed county lines, which meant they either had other assets in place or they were confident they knew where he was going. Danny parked 2 blocks away and walked through the early morning mist that clung to the mountains around Logan. The bank was a small brick building from the 1960s, the kind of place where